a molted crab and a dead crab by looking at the edge of the carapace, of the prosoma right here. If you look here, there's a big slit. That's where the crab walked out of that old shell, with the entire old hard shell behind. So all the hard parts left behind, including gill covers, legs, everything. We get a lot of calls in the fall about people walking the beach and finding tons of dead crabs, when usually it's just these molts, because they tend to float and wash up on the beaches. I mentioned before, there's a terminal molt. The female is right here. She's usually larger than the male. She'll lay about 88,000 eggs, and the male will be dragged over that nest to fertilize those eggs. They're benthic predators. They eat a lot of soft-shelled shellfish and worms. So things like soft-shell clams, mussels, razor clams, things like that. They are eaten by things like loghead turtles, crangon shrimp, various bird species, blue crabs. There's a lot of predation on them when they're young, especially in the first year of life. Once they get a little bit older, natural mortality goes down to nearly nothing. Basically, it's tiger sharks, loghead turtles, maybe a smooth dogfish might eat them. That's about it. You can't really mention horseshoe crabs without mentioning things like red knots and shorebirds. These guys eat a ton of eggs. It's estimated that in Delaware Bay, shorebirds eat over 500 tons of eggs from horseshoe crabs to fuel their long migrations. The red knot is a listed species. It is endangered. Their management is often tied to horseshoe crabs. Horseshoe crabs are not endangered, even though sometimes you do see that in the media. They are not. But because the red knot is endangered, they're often tied to it for management purposes. Adult habitat, they have fairly limited movements. There's some studies that say they only go about 4 kilometers, but there's other studies that show they go to the continental shelf, so it's somewhere in between. These troughs and channels are staged for winter and mating. This can be an issue for things like dredging. These are the same spots that they'd like to be, so if there's a dredging project, they tend to be turned up by those projects. They're most active in temperatures over 10 degrees Celsius, and they prefer protected embayments. If there's a lot of wave action, things like that, they get overturned. And that's actually a major source of mortality, is waves and being flipped over and tossed on the beach. Juveniles, those eggs are usually laid in sand, and they stay pretty close to those sandy beaches, usually in protected creeks, salt ponds, things like that. And they stay in the sand and mud where they dig for worms and other things in the mud. And they overwinter in the same area, so they don't go very far at all, especially in the first 3 years of their lives. And you see a little picture here with all these trails. Those are from juvenile crabs that have gone through the mud. It kind of looks like a mud snail trail, but there's often a little tail mark in the middle of that trail there. So you can tell the difference between a mud snail and a horseshoe crab. There's a number of population concerns. One is nitrogen. Nitrogen going into our estuaries creates these dense algae mats, which you can see here. I believe this is Quoit Bay. We have a seine survey out there where we've had trouble getting toads because we can't drag a net through this muck. Basically what happens is all that nitrogen goes in there. You have these algae mats that just cover the shorelines and some of the water. It reduces the areas that horseshoe crabs can feed, especially the juveniles. And then over time, that algae decays, sucks up all the oxygen, and can create a black oozy mud where basically just nothing lives. So it decreases the amount of area that horseshoe crabs have to live and feed. We also have these seawalls. With global warming coming, there could be more and more seawalls. That's a problem for horseshoe crabs because that takes away some of their spawning habitat. The waves bounce off those walls, kind of dig out and scour that shoreline and dig up the eggs. Another thing we see is beach grooming. I surveyed a beach in Wareham for a spawning survey. We've already seen them cover this beach twice already for grooming. So basically what happens is they drag these things along the beach and it can't uncover the eggs in the nests. So basically I said before that it takes about 2 to 4 weeks for those eggs to hatch. A lot of times we see these grooming go by right before the holidays, like 4th of July, things like that. So if they're going by 4th of July or earlier, they're uncovering all those nests for the horseshoe crabs. And previously I mentioned the dredging projects, which are a big concern for horseshoe crabs because they use that same habitat to stage. And then of course there's a commercial fishery. There's 2 main fisheries in the United States. One is for whelk bait. Basically the whelk guys use about 1/4 of a crab per trap to bait their whelk pots. That's that top picture over here. You can see 1/4 of a crab here. These are those whelks. Guys catch channel whelks, usually in Nantucket Sound. Those are mostly sold to Asia and Europe. Also, there's a biomedical fishery. There's a product made from the blood of horseshoe crabs called LAL, Limulus amoebocyte lysate. I'll talk more about that later. And also there's, not in this country, but other countries, they actually eat horseshoe crabs. So the Asian horseshoe crabs are eaten, but not in this country. I apologize for the amount of text in this slide here, but I think gives a really good historical context of what management was prior to 1998. Prior to 1998, all management was based on decimating the horseshoe crab population. Basically, they're a predator of shellfish, and a lot of people wanted them gone because they ate their shellfish. So these are all taken from annual reports from towns that they sent to DMF, my agency, documenting what they've done to limit the amount of crabs that were in the area. So this report from 1960 from Chatham, they took over 50,000 horseshoe crabs. That's basically about almost a third of our current quota for the state was taken by this one town in 1960. In 1962 in Duxbury, they killed over 14,000 crabs. There was a bounty program. They were paid 4 cents each for those live crabs. 1977 in Barnstable, skipping down to that last sentence, horseshoe crabs had come back apparently, so they killed about 2,500 of them and used them for bait for whelk. And more recently, as recently as 1996, the town of Dennis had this in shellfish regulations. No starfish, horseshoe crabs, green crabs, lady crabs, or moon snails shall be returned to the water, shall be placed high above the high water mark or suitable place out of water. The aforementioned animals are predators of shellfish. You are helping our propagation program by removing them. And then the town of Yarmouth had something similar in 1998. Now, these are mostly put in there because the state actually encouraged this. Currently, since 1998, there's now a management plan for horseshoe crabs, which is done by the Atlantic States Marine Fisheries Commission, or ASMFC. ASMFC manages a number of different species, and generally what happens is a board made up of member states from Maine down to Florida. Each state has 3 representatives on that board. So it's usually the state's director of marine fisheries, which in our case is Dan McKiernan. There's also a person, a legislative person, which in our case is Sarah Peak. There's also a person appointed by the governor, which in our case is Ray Kane, who's a commercial fisherman and works for the Cape Cod Commercial Fishermen's Alliance. Those 3 people get 1 vote on this board. For horseshoe crabs, it's only from Massachusetts down to Florida because Maine and New Hampshire don't really participate. And I'm actually on the technical committee for horseshoe crabs for this group here. My role with that group is to provide, as part of that group, is to provide management advice to that board based on the best scientific data. Also, there's an advisory panel, which is kind of industry-based. It's the industry's chance to give the board input onto how they think management should be. And usually for most species, that's all there is for committees. But in our case, for horseshoe crabs, there's also a shorebird advisory panel because shorebirds are so important, or horseshoe crabs rather, are so important for shorebirds. There's also a Delaware Bay Ecosystem Committee because Delaware Bay is the center for horseshoe crabs. There's a ton there, and it's a really important area. So in 2019, there was a stock assessment for horseshoe crabs. It updated previous assessments from 2009 and 2013. At that point in time, our region was not doing very well at all. There's 4 different regions, the Northeast, New York, Delaware, and Southeast regions. As I mentioned before, these spots here in red are showing that our area was not doing very well. This assessment is kind of odd compared to other assessments where other assessments have a lot more data, whereas horseshoe crabs, we don't have much data for them. So basically what they looked at for this assessment was took the number of surveys that were above or below the 1998 data point. So management started in 1998, looked at the surveys from that point in time, had that data point and compared it to the most recent data points we have now. So for this assessment, that was 2017. So what they looked at was the probability that data point was above or below that 1998 data point. If there's a 33% chance that if fewer than 33% of the surveys were better than that 1998 data point, you're doing pretty good. If there was 33% to 66%, you're considered neutral. And if all of your surveys are less or more than 66% of your surveys weren't doing better than 1998 data point, you're considered in poor condition. So this most recent assessment said we were in neutral condition because our survey, the MassDMF Fall survey, was doing pretty well, but the Rhode Island survey, which we were paired with, was not. So we were considered neutral. Most other areas are doing well, except for the New York region, which is New York and Connecticut. This was the first assessment to use biomedical data. Prior to that, it wasn't used because there's confidentiality issues with that. They can't release the data, so it's hard to put an assessment. Basically, they got around that by putting it into kind of a black box where the reviewers, the assessment team all had access to that data, but it's not in the final report. They had to black that part out. They use a 15% mortality rate for horseshoe crabs. That's based on published literature, modeling, and tagging data. And they determined that biomedical mortality was fairly modest. Discard mortality was a pretty big concern. They actually estimated that discard mortality, which is crabs that are caught by commercial gear but tossed back, could actually be a higher source of mortality than the bait fishery and biomedical fisheries combined. This assessment led to new regulations in New York and Connecticut. New York is putting in new lunar closures similar to what we have, where you can't catch crabs during the last moon in May or the first moon in June. Connecticut is still going through their process to get their regulations in place. They'll do something similar to New York, most likely. The next assessment will be in 2024. Usually that assessment will be an update. Usually it's a 5-year gap between the first assessment, which is a benchmark assessment, and an update. An update is basically just reviewing that previous assessment and turning the crank with new data, whereas a benchmark assessment can have new models, like all kinds of new information, new regions that they can change it any way they want, but it has to go through peer review. The peer review process basically says if the stock assessment is done properly. The next assessment is likely to have different regions. It was shown that in our region, New York and Massachusetts Rhode Island and Massachusetts have very different trends. So it's most likely that there are different crab populations there, so it'll probably be split up in the future. At the state level, we can have rules more stringent than ASMFC, but not less. So we actually have enacted that. We actually do have a number of regulations that ASMFC doesn't make us have. Our decisions are made by our DMF director, which is Dan McKiernan, as well as a Marine Fisheries Advisory Commission, which is a 9-member board appointed by our governor. They're mostly commercial fishermen. ASMFC sets our quota, which is at 330,000 crabs, but DMF has voluntarily reduced that by about half for 165,000 crabs. We have a minimum legal size. We're one of 2 states to have one at 7 inches. We have closed days where you can't keep crabs during the lunar closures or certain days for the trawl fishery. We have possession limits, so guys can't catch an unlimited amount of crabs. It depends on which gear you're using, how many crabs you can keep per day, which fishery you're involved in. We have closed areas, both federal and state ones. We have a state one in Pleasant Bay. There's also permit restrictions. If you have a hand harvest permit, if you don't have a hand harvest permit, you can't get one. There's also some restrictions on mobile gear as well. And ASMC has some recommendations for biomed restrictions. We make them requirements. On the right-hand side here, you can see some of our regulations. Most of them were put in place between 2007 and 2010 when our horseshoe crab population wasn't doing very well. We've since seen a rebound, so it looks like some of these measures have had a positive impact. So some of those measures here, the outer Cape is mostly closed off to fishing between the federal closures, which are in green and blue, and the state closure in red. That red area there is Pleasant Bay. That's only open to biomedical harvest, no bait harvest. On the right-hand side, you see our lunar closures, so there's no fishing days in yellow. There's also a few days in a kind of darker yellow orangish color with a fluke fishery, which is where most of our mobile gear fishery comes from for horseshoe crabs. The horseshoe crabs are a bycatch of the fluke fishery. Those are days where they can't fish either. So you can see there's a number of days where they can't fish at all. So every year we send an LOA, a letter of authorization, to our local biomedical firm, which is Associates of Cape Cod located in Falmouth, of how they can treat the crabs and what they can do. They have to keep crabs separated by source. Crabs can come from a person permitted to collect biomedical crabs or a bait dealer. The bait dealer can send the crabs to ACC to be bled, then ACC sends the crabs back to the bait dealer to be used as bait. Most states don't have a program like that, but we do because we feel like it's an efficient use of the resource rather than, it doesn't really save any crabs, but it's a more efficient use. But the biomedical crabs that are collected in the biomedical permit have to be returned to the water from where they're collected. And they also have to be marked to avoid rebleeding within the same year. When they're transported, they have to be transported in a truck between 50 and 60 degrees. In the lab, they have to be less than 70 degrees Fahrenheit. When crabs are out of the water exposed to heat, they don't do very well, so we're trying to avoid any kind of excess mortality. Containers can only be 2/3 full, so they usually put them in these barrels down here. We try to avoid having them crush the bottom of the barrel, so they can only be 2/3 full. Crabs have to be kept moist, and at any point in time, someone from my agency or the environmental police can inspect the facility. Horseshoe crab fisheries are nothing new. They've been going on since the 1800s. This is a picture from the king crab fishery, which is a fertilizer company. Various states used to collect over 1 million crabs per year, which is basically more than what we collect most years coast-wide now. It's been estimated that some beaches alone, they collected over 1 million crabs from like a 1 kilometer stretch of beach alone in Delaware Bay back in the day. So there was a massive number of crabs back then, but this fishery probably led to the decline. Today, there's basically 2 fisheries for horseshoe crabs as far as their methods. One is a hand harvest. The upper left picture there is a guy using a skiff They usually go along the shallows during the spawning season, May and June, collect the crabs that they see up on the beach going to spawn. We also have a dragger fishery, which I mentioned before. Mostly that's a bycatch fishery, guys targeting fluke. We'll also retain bycatch of horseshoe crabs, whelk, things like that. It used to be that 80% of the fishery was the hand harvest. Over the last several years, we've actually seen more of a switch to the mobile gear fishery, which now collects just more than half the crabs we collect annually. 2018 is the last year we have full harvester data. We have dealer data more recently than that, but for harvest data, there's 226 bait permits that were issued. 57 of those were actively fished, meaning guys actually caught crabs on those permits. There's also 6 LOAs, which are letters of authorizations issued by a director, which allow draggers to collect more crabs. Between those two groups there were 63 guys who could collect crabs, and basically between them, they average about $7,000 per person. So this isn't a huge fishery. It's basically a supplemental fishery that gets them through to make ends meet. There was also 14 biomedical permits, and 5 of those were active in 2018. In 2019, there was 14 biomedical permits issued and 4 active. So these are coast-wide landings for horseshoe crabs, up and down the coast. On the y-axis is millions of pounds, year on the x-axis. That dark gray color is the bait fishery. Those are crabs that are collected for bait. The lighter gray are crabs that are collected for biomedical. And the blue is the estimated mortality for biomedical. So it's assumed that 15% of the biomedical crabs die. If you look at the news and things like that, it's often stated that biomedical firms are bleeding all the crabs and they're responsible for this huge decline in the horseshoe crab population. But it's actually the bait fishery that collects way more crabs than the biomedical fishery. These are our landings. 2019, we actually exceeded our state quota, which was 165,000 crabs. It's the first time we've exceeded that quota. There's been a trend recently where we've been increasing in landings. It seems like it's easier and easier for guys to catch more crabs. You'll probably see why in a few slides when I get to the fisheries independent data from our trawl survey. We have a state quota of 165,000, but for the most part, we've stayed well below that until recently. Again, this is just for bait crabs, not biomedical. So this is where the crabs come from for the most part. Most of our crabs are collected in Nantucket Sound, about 80%. Lesser amounts are collected in Cape Cod Bay and areas north, about 8.2%. That's from Cape Cod Bay all the way to the New Hampshire border. 3.5% from Buzzards Bay and 8.3% from Vineyard Sound. That's from 2018 data. A large number of crabs are collected in May and June during the spawning season. You can see on the far right side there when the mobile gear fishery operates. So they're catching most of the crabs outside of the spawning season, but the hand harvest fishery cooks most of them during the spawning season. And one of the things we do is we monitor the size of the crabs coming into the market. So we've been doing that for a number of years, starting in 2008. These boxes here, the black lines are the median size that we've measured. The upper part of the box is the 75th percentile, lower is the 25th. These dashed lines are 1.5 times the interquartile range. These circles are outliers. PW is per somal width, which is the widest part of the crab. That's measured in centimeters. And we have years on the x-axis. This mark here, the red line, is the minimum legal size, which is 7 inches. You can see kind of a drop in 2014 from that median size. That's basically because we started measuring crabs longer into the year. From this period here, we only measured crabs from May and June during the spawning season. But because the dragger fishery was operating more and collecting more crabs later in the year, we started collecting more data later in the year too. We've seen a little bit of a drop in the median size of crabs collected later in the year, which is driving this. If you just compare crabs from May and June throughout this entire time series, it's pretty flat. Male horseshoe crabs pretty flat the whole time. And the male's a little bit smaller than the females. Usually they're about 1/3 smaller than the females in size. So before I get into the biomedical fishery, I'll start with how it started. It actually started on Cape Cod in Woods Hole. Pathobiologist Frederick Bang was studying horseshoe crabs along with other invertebrates. He was looking at the immune systems for these crabs because he figured if it was a primitive organism like a horseshoe crab, might be able to draw some clues into how our system works. And he was working with horseshoe crabs and noticed that their blood coagulated at certain times when they were exposed to certain bacteria. And he kind of sat on that for a while and recruited the help of Jack Levin, who was a hematologist. And Jack was able to figure out that it was a certain part of the horseshoe crab's blood that was reacting with gram-negative bacteria, which is certain types of bacteria like E. coli and Vibrio, things like that. When they came into contact with the horseshoe crab blood, the blood coagulated because of amoebocyte cells in the horseshoe crab's blood. Melanocyte cells operate similar to how our white blood cells act, and they're an important part of the immune system for horseshoe crabs. When they came into contact with those gram-negative bacteria, they formed a clot as a way to prevent the crab from getting infections. So they used that product and formed LAL, which is luminous amebocyte lysate. Stan Watson, also from Woods Hole, took the product that these guys made and commercialized it. And now it's a pretty big industry. There's 5 companies now. Actually, I think one of them actually might have gone under, so I think it's 4 now, or somebody might have combined. We have one in this region, Associates of Cape Cod. When I was an undergrad, my job during the summers was to work for Associates of Cape Cod as a bleeder there. So I have a pretty good idea of what they do and how that process works. The crabs are returned to the water if they're collected under a biomedical permit. There's an estimated mortality of 5 to 30%. The 2 studies that said it was 30%, one was from our agency. That study there had a significant tank effect, which means that for whatever reason, crabs from that tank died at higher rates than other tanks. So whether they were controls or if they were bled, they died. So the average from that study is a little high, in my opinion. And this other study that had 30% said that they used methods that were far exceeding what the biomedical firms do. They kept the crabs out for multiple days, they exposed them to heat, things like that, and they made no claims that they were trying to mimic what the biomedical firms are doing. So it was a little high. On the other side, the 5%, they weren't really following what the biomedical firms are doing either. So at this extreme ends, it was a little washy. It's generally assumed that 50% of the crabs that are bled die. That's based on tagging data, that's based on modeling, that's based on various studies. One of the issues with horseshoe crabs is there's data confidentiality with these firms that complicates assessments because you can't really release all the data. There's also possible lethal effects from bleeding, which we don't really know very much about. There could be disorientation, there could be reduced activity. There's been a couple studies done on this, but they use methods that exceeded what the biomedical firms actually do. They left them out for multiple days, exposed them to heat, things like that. So we don't really know what the cause of that disorientation or reduced activity was. Was it the heat? Was it the extra days out? Or we don't really know. So that's an area that we really need to improve upon as far as our knowledge. We also look at the biomedical crabs when they come to the markets. Basically, it's fairly stable, kind of bounces around a little bit. Females on the left, males on the right. Now getting to our fisheries independent data, which is our scientific trawl surveys and other surveys. This is a Gloria Michelle. This is a NOAA federal vessel that we use to do state surveys in May and September. So this is a dragger that goes around the entire state. This is where we catch crabs. Most of our crabs are actually from Nantucket Sound, right where the commercial catch data was from. We also have some around Wellfleet and Barnstable Harbor, but for the most part, they're south of Cape Cod. We don't really see anything in deeper water or north of Cape Cod. This is the data from the trawl surveys. It's showing a pretty good increase. We've never had more crabs in spring survey than we had the last few years. This is from southern New England, so only areas south of Cape Cod. This is a stratified mean number of crabs we catch per tow. The spring survey is doing pretty well. That blue line there is a low S smoother, which is a trend line. The shaded area around it is the confidence interval around that trend line. Those blue dots are individual data points. That red dashed line is a time series median. So we're seeing we're catching a lot more crabs now than we had back in the day. And this is about a 40-year time series. So it's a relative abundance survey, which means we compare 1 year to the rest of the time series. And it's doing pretty well right now. Going to the Gulf of Maine, areas north of Cape Cod, we see basically the same trend. Last few years have been really good, both in spring and fall. The other survey we do is a spawning beach survey. These pictures here are taken from Delaware Bay. You will never see these kind of densities here. We don't have anything like this. The survey is very different down there. Around here, you might see something like this. This was taken at the mouth of Bass River a couple weeks ago by Eric Hunter, who surveys for us. He's involved with a survey that he also cooperates with the Friends of Bass River on this survey. There's about 20 crabs in this picture here. He counted about 245 crabs in a 380 meter stretch of beach last week during the moon. But we do have a lot of surveys where we see no crabs at all, so it's somewhat unusual to see this many crabs. So like I said before, they get a lot more crabs down in Delaware Bay. Down there, they use a 1 meter square quadrat, which is this little white thing here. And basically, sometimes they get so many crabs, they have to unstack the crabs. They think they have an issue with density, where they think they can't fit another crab in those quadrats there. So they think they're underestimating how many crabs they have. Around here, we don't have as many crabs as them. We're towards the northern extreme of the range, so they're less numerous. Individual crabs are smaller for us. So what we use is a 25 square meter quadrat, which is this here is 5 meters across. And then we extend this out 5 meters into the water and count the number of crabs inside that area. We have 17 different beaches we survey. I survey beach number 17 here in Swift's Beach in Wareham. All these other beaches are done by volunteers and volunteer organizations who arrange these. So we really depend on a lot of volunteers because these surveys occur on the same night. I can't beat all these spots at once. So we really rely on a number of volunteer organizations to do this survey. Most of these surveys have been going on since 2008 or 2009, but there's been a number that have come on more recently, like this number 12 at Bass River has been around for about 3 years now. So this is data from the Cape Cod Bay sites. There's one site in Duxbury, one site in Barnstable, and one site in Wellfleet Harbor. These are all taken at night. There's other surveys that are done during the day, but I didn't include those. There's also some that haven't been done that long, so I didn't include those either. So these are the original sites that have been going on for a long time. There's been a bit of a decline lately, but a small increase most recently. So hopefully we're going to keep seeing that coming up. We'll see. Outer Cape Cod, we're seeing an increase lately. Some of the beaches actually have set records lately for Outer Cape Cod, so hopefully that trend continues. So that's the area where Pleasant Bay is, where most of our biomedical harvest comes from. Nantucket and Vineyard Sound, where most of our bait harvest comes from. We've had 2 beaches actually set records last year, 2 of the 3. That's showing an upward trend. Generally, it's kind of a flat line here, but it kind of comes up for this one data point. We see kind of a more prolonged increase in the trawl survey than you do in the spawning surveys. That's probably because the trawl surveys catch juvenile crabs as well, whereas these guys are only catching adult mature crabs. So that could partially explain why the trawl survey picked this up a little bit earlier than the spawning survey has. This is the Bass River data set. It's only been going on for 3 years now. So there isn't too much we can say about this. As I mentioned before, this is a relative abundance survey. So what really matters is being able to compare 1 year to the rest of the time series. We can't really say too much based on 3 years of data. So we're hoping to collect more data going forward with Eric's help. This is Buzz's Bay. This is the area that I survey. This is the area that isn't doing particularly well. Even though there isn't much bait harvest or biomedical harvest in this area, it still hasn't really bounced back yet. To summarize, abundance appears to be increasing, but there's still number of anthropogenic concerns, such as beach grooming and other things. There's a number of ways you can get involved if you want to. You can volunteer for the spawning beach survey, or if you're interested in horseshoe crab management, you can sign up for our listserv, which I'll show a link for here or soon. I'd like to thank most of the volunteer organizations that help us with that spawning beach survey. We couldn't do it without these people and the volunteers who helped them. This here is a link for that listserv that we have. If you only care about horseshoe crabs, you can actually click a box to only be notified when there's horseshoe crab management measures coming into place, or if you want to be able to speak publicly about what you think horseshoe crab management should look like, there's a way to do that based on this link here. If you don't want to copy that down, you can always email me at this address. I'll send you that link. This is most of our social media sites. And at this point, I'll take any questions if you guys have any.
That was terrific. Thanks a lot, Derek.
Not a problem.
Very interesting animal.
It definitely is. And it gets a lot of interest too. It's funny to see like our social media posts. We have white sharks around here. It's often that we'll actually get more likes and shares, everything else from the horseshoe crab stuff than we do from some of the white shark stuff. Which is baffling to me. It's white sharks. Like everyone, it's always in the news and everything else, but people actually like horseshoe crabs more. Well, in some cases.
Huh. Well, they're a living fossil.
Exactly.
You can submit questions in the chat if you want. I have allowed you to unmute yourself, and I've unmuted you if you want to ask a question. You're certainly welcome to do that.
Hi, I have a question.
Yep.
Yeah, go ahead.
Just yesterday, I read an article about horseshoe crabs and the bleeding industry,
yep.
And it left me totally confused. First of all, they said mortality is more than likely 30%, not 15%. But then it was really about the artificial blood apparently is possible they're making or working on. But then it got even more confusing because that industry has been put under a separate heading so that they can't really do comparisons about how useful the artificial is as opposed to the original. Could you talk a little bit about that, about the development of an artificial or a synthetic blood?
Yeah, that's been in the works for a long time. When I worked at ACC during summers when I was an undergrad, there was always rumors that that was coming about. It was in the news for a fair amount. There was always something, but there's nothing ever seems to develop. There's been a number more recently that have gained a little bit of traction, but they don't seem to be. It's basically the point now where I'll believe it when I see it, because it's been in the news so many times that the next thing's coming and just it never actually happens. Part of it's FDA stuff, but it's various reasons. But just for whatever reason, nothing's really come to the market that's worked and FDA's approved. So it'll probably happen at some point, but it's basically the point now where I'll believe it when I see it. As far as those studies, in my opinion, it is closer to 15% than it is 30. I mentioned before, there's been 2 studies that said it was 30%. One of those made never stated that they were trying to mimic what the bleeding labs were doing. They just basically took the crabs, bled them, left them out in kind of an extreme case to see what would happen. It wasn't close to what the biomedical firms do now, or even did back then. Basically, we have laws in place that wouldn't allow them to do that. So basically, if they did what those studies did for the 30%, they'd be violating the regulations. There was another study done by my agency, which I mentioned before, which their estimate was 30% for females, but there was a significant tank effect, which means that at least one of the tanks in that study had a very high mortality rate above all the other ones. So no matter if it was a bled crab or a control crab, meaning it wasn't bled, there was a very high mortality rate in that tank for some reason. So that can't really be used as an average. Most of the studies showed around 15%. There's also been some modeling of the population during the stock assessment, which showed it's about 15% most likely. And also there's been some tagging data, which shows it's probably close to 15%. So I do believe that 15%. I don't think it's much less. I don't think it's much more. Did that answer your question? Was there another part to that?
No, that's about it. Yeah, thank you.
No problem.
I have a question.
Yep.
Just about other real crab species. And heard a little bit about some invasive crabs in our area, and I didn't know if you wanted to tell people about those.
Yeah, well, most of what our agency does now for invasive species for crabs is dealing with green crabs, which
Right.
thankfully I somehow got out of, which I'm very happy about. That's more of a North Shore issue. So one of our North Shore biologists actually took that one, so I'm pretty stoked about that. But basically what we've been doing, the state government has been giving us money to do eradication programs. So there's been some towns in the North Shore who've been getting money from the state to basically try to eradicate green crabs because they eat shellfish and kind of erodes some of the habitat. Those guys have been around for a long time. They've been in this country for a couple hundred years now, probably. So I don't really consider them that invasive anymore. Like they're here, they're established. There's also some marsh crabs that get a lot of publicity around the Cape and stuff. Those guys are native. It's thought that they may erode banks and things like that. I've seen some papers where they think that the lack of predators has had an impact on the crab population, where the crab population is going up. I don't know. Mostly what I see in those areas is there's a lot of people there too. So people using boats going through channels and creating ways to go to the marsh banks and erode the banks. So I think there's a bunch of different issues there.
Thanks. Do green crabs compete with blue crabs for habitat? Or?
A little bit, but generally it's thought that blue crabs outcompete the green crabs, which is why you don't see as many south of Cape Cod. Green crabs anyway. So a blue crab will eat green crabs, and they're just a much more vicious predator. So usually blue crabs will win out that fight, no problem. We don't have as many blue crabs north of Cape Cod as we do south of Cape Cod, so we see more green crabs.
Interesting. Great. Anyone else have any burning questions about crabs or horseshoe crabs on the line here? One last question that I have is about beach raking. And has there ever been any proposed measures to restrict beach raking in this state because of
Not to
horseshoe
my knowledge.
crabs or shorebird concerns?
Not to my knowledge, but we're raising that with some of the towns, trying to get them to stop doing that. At least only do it above the high tide mark.
Yeah.
Generally, what I see when I do it during the spawning beaches, like they'll come through, you can see the rake marks. When I go around the tide line, it's a soupy mess. So I'll sink up to my knees, where usually it's firm sand. So you can tell that if there was any nests there, they're being turned up, they're being exposed, and those eggs would probably drift somewhere else. So I personally think it's a pretty big issue. A lot of times things like jetties and stuff get a lot of press, but I think things like beach nourishment, dredging, just that grooming of the beaches is a bigger problem, plus the nitrogen issues in the Cape and other places.
Yeah, agreed. Richard, did you have a question?
Where did you get your degree?
Undergrad was from URI, master's was from UMass Dartmouth.
Very good.
I have a question.
Yep.
Okay. Hi.
Hi.
First of all, thank you very much, Derek. That was a great presentation.
Thank you.
I just read recently that the Cape Cod Canal is being closed to commercial striped bass fishing, and for a multitude of reasons, most of which make a lot of sense, and it does seem like a very good idea. Going on from there, listening to what you have to say, and also seeing a lot of those images of fishermen coming into, for example, the Bass River, that's our area. So
yep.
To collect all of these crabs, it does seem that more, whatever, regulations or something, some effort should be put in place. It was also a little frightening to see that it really was the Nantucket Sound side that is, we're going to say a prime spot, a high percentage collection area. So those things being said, I guess I'm just throwing it back at you and saying, is there any plans for additional kinds of, and I'm not quite sure what to call them, whether we call them restrictions or certainly efforts to be made to ensure that these very valuable horseshoe crabs are preserved?
There are a number of groups that are pushing for total bans on the harvest of horseshoe crabs. Mass Audubon does a lot of work for that. My job is to basically look at the sustainability of the horseshoe crab resource. There's other elements outside that get more political as far as what the people want. This is a state resource. It belongs to people of the state or the United States in some cases. But this is a state resource, so the people have a pretty big say, which is why I put that link up there. If you care about management of the species, I encourage you to sign up for that listserv that we have and check all the boxes for horseshoe crabs. If you do that, I'd also recommend that you do fluke and whelk, because those are the fisheries that also impact horseshoe crabs. So if you want to be notified of anything that's coming up for those species, I suggest you follow that link there or email me and I'll provide it for you. There's a lot of things that happen with management. There's basically three things. It's money, science, and politics that get these things done. So if you cover the political aspect of it, I mean, that's part of it. So if the people of the state want something a certain way, it goes a long way.
Great. Thank you very much, Derek.
No problem.
Thanks, Gail.
Thank you.
And also, Eric Hunter joined us for the webinar. So thank you, Eric, for your volunteer work for the horseshoe crab surveys.
Thank you, Eric.
It seems like a great. I'm sorry. Go ahead.
Actually, I got to run. I got to go do a survey right now. I enjoyed the survey, or the presentation was very good. Thank you.
Thank you.
Terrific.
Yes, if anyone wants to help Eric, we're always taking more volunteers for the survey at various spots, all of them basically. We're not really taking volunteers for this year for Swiss Beach and Wareham because of the COVID issue. There are some beaches that aren't being done this year because of the COVID issue, but there are a number that still are. So if you wanted to help, there's still a possibility of helping out this year.
And before I mute myself, okay, I also wanted to make sure I had put it into the chat that my husband and I participated in the horseshoe crab surveys with Eric Hunter and the Friends of Bass River. It is absolutely the best kind of work. It's really very, very satisfying, and I would, certainly encourage people to volunteer
Thank you very
when
much.
they can.
Terrific. Well, if there are no more questions, I'll just say thanks a lot, Derek, for sharing all your knowledge and these great resources for people to learn more about horseshoe crab management and fisheries management in general. The public, like you said, the public does have some say in these regulations. So, stay involved and hopefully, we can conserve all these resources for the next generations for millennia to come. So thanks again. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
And if anyone has any follow-up questions, feel free to email me, and I will be quiet now for a moment in case there are any remaining questions.
Nope, thanks very much. It's wonderful.
Thank you.
All right, and like I said, I will be sending out a survey to all who have signed up for our webinars. So look for that in your email probably next week. And we look forward to getting feedback from you about what you're looking for going forward. And check out our newsletter. And hope you have a great weekend. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.